Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's episode of the Positive Proof Podcast. I'm your host, Parmis Najmi, and I'm so glad that you're here. If you want to listen to more episodes like this one on self-improvement, mindset, and wellness, go ahead and hit that follow button to join the family. Before I get into today's episode, I just want to ask you guys for a quick and kind favor, and that is if you haven't yet left a review, I would absolutely appreciate if you could do so. It helps so much to build this podcast and help it grow so that we can increase the positive impact we make and just overall make it a bigger community. Also, if you are looking for daily motivation, follow me on Instagram at Positive Proof Podcast, where I post behind the scenes content and daily quotes that serve as sweet daily reminders. And if anyone is wondering how to leave episode requests, you can actually send me your thoughts via the DM me your thoughts link in the description or via Instagram DM as well. Now, if you're new here, quick little intro about me is I am 27 years old, based in Toronto, and I started this podcast after a few big life shifts from leaving my 9-to-5, going full-time on a business with my boyfriend, and just realizing I had way too much to say about self-growth, relationships, and just becoming the woman I actually want to be. So I'm just really happy you're here. And with that, let's get into today's episode. So today we're talking about something that I genuinely think does not get talked about enough, and that is complaining. More specifically, why it feels so darn good to complain, but might actually be rewiring your brain in ways you don't really realize. So I want you to think about this for just a second. When was the last time that you vented? Maybe it was about a guy, your job, a friend, your family, just something that felt unfair. And when the person you were talking to agreed with you when they said, "No, you are so right," didn't it feel so relieving? Almost bonding, like you were suddenly on the same team? That feeling is not random. There is actual neuroscience behind it. Your brain rewards you for shared frustration. It releases dopamine when you feel validated. And over time, if we're not careful, we can actually train our brains to look for things to complain about simply because it feels connecting. Now, this isn't going to be an episode about toxic positivity. I'm not here to tell you to suppress your emotions or pretend everything is fine, but I do want to explore what happens when venting turns into a habit, and when bonding turns into co-rumination, and when frustration quietly becomes part of your identity. Because there's real research showing that chronic complaining can increase stress hormones, strengthen negativity bias, and even reinforce a subtle victim mindset over time. And I think once you understand the science behind it, you'll never look at a vent session the same way again. Now, quick poll check-in for those of you tuning in on Spotify. I want to know where you stand. So scroll down and vote in this week's poll. How many times a day do you find yourself complaining? If you don't know the answer, that's okay. Just take a guess and pay attention this week to the number of times you complain, because you might be surprised at this tiny harmful habit that we rarely pay attention to. I'm very curious to see what you guys have to say, and without further ado, let's get into it. So point number one is that complaining releases dopamine, which I mentioned earlier, and that is why it feels addictive. And I want to start this episode by admitting something that I don't think we talk about enough, and that is the fact that complaining just simply feels really good. Like, if we're being completely honest with ourselves, there is just something so satisfying about sitting down with a friend and venting about the guy who annoyed you, or the coworker who crossed the line, or the situation that just felt unfair. And when your friend responds with, "You are so right, you have every right to be upset or annoyed, I would be mad too," once they say that, you can literally feel your body soften, your shoulders drop. You just feel understood. There's almost this sense of relief that washes over you, like, okay, I'm not crazy. I'm not overreacting. I'm validated. And I think it's really important that we start here, because complaining doesn't feel good by accident. There's actual science behind why it feels bonding and relieving in the moment. When you complain and someone agrees with you, your brain releases dopamine. Dopamine is the neurotransmitter associated with reward and reinforcement. It's the same chemical involved when you achieve something, when you get social approval, when you experience pleasure. It's basically your brain saying, that felt good. Let's remember that. But what's interesting is that your brain isn't rewarding you because complaining is productive or because it's solving anything. It's rewarding you because you just experienced social validation. And from an evolutionary standpoint, being accepted by your group meant survival. If you were rejected or isolated thousands of years ago, that was dangerous. So our nervous systems are deeply wired to seek agreement and reassurance from the people around us. So when someone confirms that your frustration makes sense, your brain interprets that as safety. It interprets it as belonging, and belonging regulates the nervous system. So in that moment of mutual venting, your body isn't just bonding socially, it's calming down physiologically. Of course, that's going to feel good. And there's actually research on something called co-rumination, which is when people repeatedly talk through problems together in detail without necessarily moving towards solutions. And studies show that co-rumination increases feelings of closeness, especially among women. And women, on average, tend to bond through emotional sharing. So when you and your friends sit there dissecting the same situation from every angle, replaying it, analyzing it, adding new layers to it, your brains are literally strengthening the sense of intimacy between you two. It's not dramatic, it's neurological. And I think that's really important to say because I'm not here to shame emotional expression, okay? Processing emotions is actually very healthy, and feeling understood is healthy. Sharing is healthy. But here's where it gets subtle and maybe a little uncomfortable. If your brain starts associating complaining with connection, validation, and dopamine, it will start seeking more of the behavior that creates that reward. Your brain does not differentiate between this is helping me grow and this just feels good right now. It just tracks what got reinforced. And if irritation leads to bonding and bonding leads to dopamine, your brain quietly learns that irritation equals reward. So sometimes we think we're venting because, we need clarity or because we're just processing something and something that's true. But sometimes, if we're being honest, we're venting because we want someone to confirm that we are right. We want that agreement. We want that reassurance that our perspective is justified. And again, that doesn't make you immature or toxic or negative. That makes you human. Our brains are wired to protect our ego and reinforce our worldview. The issue isn't the occasional vent session. The issue is when complaining becomes one of the primary ways that we connect. When frustration becomes the most reliable conversation starter, when negativity becomes the glue, the issue isn't the occasional vent session. The issue is when complaining becomes one of the primary ways we connect, when frustration becomes the most reliable conversation starter, and when negativity becomes the glue. Because over time, the brain adapts to whatever we practice. And if we consistently practice spotting what's wrong or what's unfair or what's irritating, our brain gets very efficient at finding those things. And this is where the addiction piece comes in, not in a dramatic way, but in a subtle reinforcement loop. If every time you complain, you receive validation and closeness, that loop strengthens. You don't consciously decide to look for things to be annoyed about. It just becomes easier to notice them. Your brain starts scanning for what will produce the next hit of agreement. So before we even talk about whether complaining is good or bad, I just want you to understand this foundation. It feels good because your brain is rewarding it. It feels bonding because your nervous system equates agreement with safety. It feels relieving because validation reduces uncertainty. None of that makes you weak. It makes you wired the way all humans are wired. But anything that gets rewarded consistently becomes easier to repeat, and anything repeated enough becomes a pattern. And patterns over time start shaping the way you see the world. Now, moving on to point number 2, we're going to talk about how repetition rewires the brain. This is neuroplasticity and negativity bias. So now that we understand why complaining feels good in the moment, we need to talk about what happens when it becomes repetitive, because this is where it shifts from something harmless to something that can quietly reshape the way your brain operates. So there's a concept in neuroscience called neuroplasticity, which basically means your brain is constantly rewiring itself based on what you repeatedly think, feel, and do. And the phrase you'll often hear is neurons that fire together, wire together. And what that means in simple terms is that whatever mental pathways you use most frequently become stronger and more automatic over time. By the way, by no means am I an expert. I have learned all things neuroplasticity through reading and through YouTube videos. I highly suggest reading up on the topic because it's very interesting. But back to what I was saying, your brain is efficient, okay? It wants to conserve energy. So the more you practice a certain thought pattern, the easier and faster your brain will access it. So let's apply that to complaining. If you regularly focus on what's wrong, what's unfair, or what's irritating, or what's disappointed you, you are strengthening the neural pathways associated with noticing problems. You are essentially training your brain to scan for flaws, not because you're a negative person, but because your brain adapts to what you repeatedly rehearse. And this ties into something called the negativity bias. As humans, we're already wired to pay more attention to negative information over positive information. Through an evolution standpoint, this made sense. Noticing threats kept us alive. If there are 10 beautiful flowers and one snake, your brain will fixate on the snake. So our brains are naturally more sensitive to problems, criticism, and perceived threats than to neutral or positive stimuli. Now, imagine layering repeated complaining on top of that built-in bias. You are essentially amplifying a system that already leans negative. And over time, your brain becomes hyper efficient at detecting what's wrong. You walk into a room and immediately notice what feels off. You scroll social media and immediately compare. You go on a date and immediately clock the red flags before even allowing some curiosity. It becomes automatic, and because it's automatic, it feels like truth. But here's the part that most people don't realize. Chronic complaining also impacts your stress response. Research has shown that repeatedly verbalizing negative experiences without resolution can increase cortisol, which is the primary stress hormone. And cortisol, when elevated long-term, affects your mood, immune function, and even cognitive flexibility. So if complaining becomes a daily habit, you're not just reinforcing a mental lens, you are subtly keeping your nervous system in a state of stress. And the tricky part is that it doesn't feel like stress when you're doing it. It feels like bonding. It feels like venting. It feels like release. But physiologically, your body is reliving the frustration each time you replay it. Your brain doesn't fully differentiate between something happening in real time and something vividly remembered. So every time you retell the story with emotion, your body responds again. This is why some people feel drained after long vent sessions instead of lighter. And I want to be careful here because I'm not saying you should suppress your emotions whatsoever. Suppression is not healthy either, okay? What I am highlighting, though, is repetition without resolution. There is a difference between processing something once or twice to understand it and rehearsing it over and over because it feels validating. When you repeatedly rehearse negativity, you strengthen the neural circuit for negativity. And because of neuroplasticity, the more that circuit fires, the more dominant it becomes. Eventually, it's not even conscious. It just becomes your default lens. Some people call this being, quote, realistic or, quote, just honest. But sometimes it's just a well-trained brain doing what it's practiced over time. And this is where it connects back to identity. So if you spend enough time focusing on what's wrong, your brain begins to assume that the world is just primarily wrong, that people are primarily disappointing, that circumstances are primarily unfair. And once that belief takes root, your brain will gather evidence to support it because that's what our brains do. They confirm the patterns they already know. So the real question isn't, is complaining bad? The real question is, what am I training my brain to look for? Because your brain will become excellent at whatever you practice. And that is so powerful, but it's also a responsibility. Moving on to point number 3, we're going to talk about how co-rumination strengthens bonds but weakens identity. Now, this next part is the one that I think is going to make some of you pause a little bit because yes, complaining bonds people. We just talked about that. It increases closeness. It creates that we're in this together feeling, but What we don't really talk about is what happens when negativity becomes the foundation of connection. There is something very powerful about mutual frustration. When you and someone else dislike the same thing, feel wronged in the same way, or share the same complaint, it creates instant alignment. It almost feels like loyalty, like we're on the same team. And psychologically, shared adversity has always been a fast track to bonding. It creates a sense of unity. That's why coworkers bond over a difficult boss. That's why entire friend groups can revolve around dissecting their dating lives. That's why the quote men are trash conversations can go on for hours and feel weirdly intimate for some people. But here's the question I want you to sit with. If you remove the drama, the frustration, the thing you both complained about, what would be left? Just think about it. If you removed all that complaining, what would be left of that conversation or of that friendship or of that relationship? Because research on co-rumination shows that while it increases closeness in the short term, it's also associated with higher levels of anxiety and depressive symptoms over time. When conversations repeatedly center around problems without moving toward growth or solutions, it keeps both people emotionally immersed in stress. And the closeness that forms can start to depend on that shared negativity. This is where it gets subtle. If your primary way of bonding with someone is venting, criticizing, or analyzing what's wrong, then your identity inside that friendship can slowly start to revolve around being the one who is frustrated, wronged, or disappointed. And I don't mean it in an obvious victim way. I mean it in a subtle reinforcement way. If every time you see a friend, the conversation begins with what annoyed you this week, what went wrong, or who let you down, or who judged you, or who you're tired of, your brain starts associating connection with being in a negative emotional state. So when things are calm and when life is steady and when there isn't much to complain about, the friendship can feel quieter, sometimes even boring. And that's when people unconsciously stir something up just to feel that intensity again. And this isn't about cutting off your friends or never venting again. It's about asking yourself whether your connections are built on expansion or just mutual irritation.
Let's take a quick break.
Hi, I'm Sarah Beth Herman, a 5-time CEO and host of the podcast No Silver Spoons. This show is for leaders, entrepreneurs, and people building something meaningful without shortcuts. We talk about leadership, mindset, business growth, and the real lessons that come from doing hard things really well. And if you're in the dental industry, you'll hear a few episodes that speak directly to that world too. Because no matter your field, leadership is leadership. Listen to No Silver Spoons wherever you get your podcasts.
And there's also another layer here, which is identity reinforcement. The more you verbally rehearse a certain narrative, such as, I always attract the wrong men, or work is always exhausting, or people are just so fake, nothing ever works out for me. The more that narrative becomes part of how you see yourself, and when other people consistently validate that narrative, it solidifies. It becomes familiar. It actually becomes who you are in that social circle. And the tricky part is that it can actually feel empowering at first because it feels like you're being understood. But if no one ever gently challenges you, if no one ever says, okay, well, what are you going to do about it? Or is there another way to see this? Then your growth is going to stall if no one challenges you like that. The bond stays, but evolution doesn't. And I've noticed this in my own life before. There were times when certain friendships, actually multiple friendships, felt extremely close. But when I zoomed out, I realized a huge portion of our conversations revolved around what was wrong. And when I started shifting my mindset, when I started focusing more on, solutions, goals, gratitude, or self-responsibility, some of those dynamics naturally changed. Not because anyone was bad, but because the glue was changing. And I think that's the real takeaway here. Bonding over pain is very human. Bonding over frustration is easy. But bonding over growth, vision, accountability, and expansion, it requires a higher level of emotional maturity. So the question becomes, do your conversations leave you feeling lighter, inspired, and empowered? Or do they leave you feeling validated but drained? because those are two very different outcomes. And over time, the one you choose repeatedly shapes not only your friendships, but your identity within them. Moving on to point number 4, we're going to talk about the victim identity loop. Now, this is where it gets a little deeper, and I want to approach it gently because this part isn't about blame, it's about awareness. When complaining becomes repetitive and unresolved, it can slowly start reinforcing something psychologists call learned helplessness. So learned helplessness was studied by Martin Seligman, I think that's how you pronounce his name, and it describes what happens when someone repeatedly experiences stress or discomfort and begins to believe that they have no control over changing it. And over time, they stop trying, not because they're incapable, but because their brain has learned that effort doesn't make a difference. And I think this concept is really important in the context of chronic complaining. If you repeatedly talk about what's wrong in your life without taking action, so if every week it's the same frustrations, the same people disappointing you, the same job draining you, the same dating patterns repeating, your brain slowly absorbs a message. It's not loud or dramatic, but it sounds like, this is just how it is, or this always happens to me, or there's nothing I can really do. That's what your brain says. And the more that narrative is rehearsed verbally, the more real it feels. Again, this doesn't mean the frustrations aren't valid. It doesn't mean you haven't been hurt or that circumstances haven't genuinely been unfair. They've been unfair in my life too. Life can be absolutely unfair for just about anybody. But there's a difference between acknowledging pain and building an identity around being the one that things happen to. Because when you constantly reinforce the story of being wronged, overlooked, unlucky, or stuck, your sense of agency starts shrinking. Agency is your belief that your actions matter, that you can influence outcomes, that you can respond in ways that shape your life. And research consistently shows that people with a strong internal locus of control, meaning they believe they have influence over their circumstances, tend to be more resilient, more motivated, and generally have better mental health outcomes. But complaining without action subtly shifts you toward an external locus of control. It places the power outside of you. The boss is the problem. The men are the problem. The economy is the problem. Society is the problem. And again, sometimes those things are flawed. But if the story ends there, you've removed yourself from the equation. And this is the part that's uncomfortable because taking ownership is harder than venting. Venting releases emotions very quickly, but ownership requires reflection. Ownership asks, okay, given that this is happening, what can I control? Given the external circumstances, what can I do? It asks whether you're tolerating something you don't actually have to tolerate. It asks whether you've set the boundary you keep complaining about not having. It asks whether you're repeating patterns that you haven't examined. Complaining can feel empowering in the moment because you're expressing yourself, but action builds self-respect, and self-respect feels different. It feels quieter, it feels grounded, it feels like stability rather than intensity. There's also research linking repetitive rumination, meaning cycling the same negative thoughts without moving towards solutions, to increased anxiety and depressive symptoms. I mentioned this earlier, but when the brain keeps replaying an unresolved issue, it stays activated. It doesn't reach closure. Your nervous system doesn't fully settle because there's no forward movement. So if you're constantly venting about the same situation without changing anything, your brain begins to associate you with stagnation. It internalizes the belief that you are someone who endures circumstances rather than alters them. And over time, that belief becomes part of your identity. I've noticed this pattern in myself before. There were moments in my life where I could have kept complaining about a situation for months, honestly. I would have gotten endless validation for it. But the moment I decided to actually change something and take responsibility, have the hard conversation and leave the environment and adjust my standards, that shifted more for my confidence than all the venting ever could. Because when you take action, even small action, you send your brain a completely different message. You send it the message that you're capable, that you're not powerless, that your responses matter. And that message strengthens something inside you that complaining alone never will. So again, this isn't about suppressing emotions or pretending that everything is fine. It's about noticing when processing has turned into rehearsing and when rehearsing has turned into identity. There's a huge difference between this hurt me and this is just my life. And the direction you move in after that realization shapes not only your mindset, but your self-concept. Because the more you act on what bothers you, the more your brain learns that you are someone who responds, adapts, and evolves. And that shift from helpless to capable is where real power lives. Moving on to the last point number 5, we're going to talk about the shift from venting to emotional leadership. So now that we've unpacked why complaining feels good and how it rewires the brain and how it can slowly reinforce helplessness, the question becomes, what do we actually do with this? Because the goal isn't to become emotionally robotic. The goal isn't to never vent again or pretend you're above frustration. That's just not realistic, and it's not healthy either. The real shift is moving from unconscious complaining to conscious processing. It's the difference between rehearsing negativity and leading your emotions. Emotional leadership is a term I really, really love because it doesn't mean suppressing how you feel. It means guiding how you express and move through what you feel. It means asking yourself before you vent, what do I actually need right now? Do I need empathy? Do I need reassurance? Do I need advice? Or am I just looking for agreement? That level of awareness alone changes everything because when you know what you're seeking, you are much less likely to spiral into repetitive negativity just for the dopamine hit of validation. There's also a huge difference between processing and performing frustration because processing sounds like, this upset me and I want to understand why. But performing sounds like repeatedly trying to make the story sound more dramatic in a way that keeps you emotionally charged. And your body feels the difference. When you process something in a grounded way, you usually feel lighter afterward. And when you rehearse it dramatically over and over, you often feel more agitated, even if you were validated. So a powerful reframe here is asking yourself, after this conversation, do I feel empowered or just justified? Because feeling justified isn't the same as feeling strong. Justification reinforces ego. Empowerment reinforces growth. And high-level emotional maturity is choosing empowerment even when justification would feel so much easier. Another shift is consciously expanding what you bond over. Instead of always connecting through what's wrong, start experimenting with connecting through vision, through accountability, through gratitude, through goals. Talk about what you're building. Talk about what you're learning. Talk about what you're proud of. It might feel slightly unnatural at first because your brain is used to bonding through shared frustration, but over time, those conversations create a different emotional tone in your relationships. They feel lighter, more forward-moving, less heavy. This doesn't mean you can't ever say, I had a terrible day. It just means you don't stay there. You move through it and you vent briefly. Then you ask, okay, so what now? And that what now question changes everything. It brings you back into agency. It brings you back into choice. There's also something very powerful about noticing your language. If you catch yourself saying things like, this always happens to me, or people are just the worst, or nothing ever works out, just pause and gently challenge it. Not in a toxic positivity way, but in a grounded way. Like, is that fully true, or is that your brain reinforcing a familiar narrative? Even ever so slightly softening the language changes the impact. Like, this always happens to me becomes, this pattern keeps showing up and I need to understand why. Just that shift alone moves you from passive to reflective. And listen, at the end of the day, emotional leadership isn't about being perfect. It's about being aware. It's about noticing when complaining is serving connection and when it's quietly shaping your mindset in ways you don't want. Because the truth is, your brain will become excellent at whatever you practice. If you practice spotting problems, you'll become sharp at detecting flaws. If you practice seeking solutions, you'll become resilient. If you practice gratitude and growth alongside honesty, your nervous system will begin associating connection with expansion rather than frustration. And that is the real goal here. Not silence, not suppression, but evolution. Choosing to bond in ways that strengthen you instead of drain you. Choosing to process in ways that lead somewhere instead of looping. And choosing to lead your emotional world instead of being led by whatever feels validating in the moment. So I don't want you leaving this episode thinking that you can never complain again, because again, that is not realistic and it's really not the point. You're human, I'm human, you're going to get frustrated, I'm going to get frustrated, and sometimes you're just going to need a vent sometimes. The point is simply awareness. It's just noticing what you rehearse, and it's noticing what your brain is getting really good at spotting, because your brain is always adapting to the stories that you repeat, and over time, those stories become your lens. I'll say it one last time. If you constantly rehearse what's wrong, your world will start to feel overwhelmingly wrong. But if you process what's wrong and then shift towards solution, ownership, or even small moments of gratitude, your brain recalibrates. It starts scanning for possibility instead of just problems. And that is very empowering because it means your mindset isn't fixed, it's trained. So this week, I want you to just observe yourself. Just don't even try to fix yourself. Just notice how often you complain. Notice how you feel afterward. Do you feel lighter or just justified? And maybe experiment with just one small shift. Instead of looping the frustration, ask yourself, okay, what now? That question alone changes everything. So if this episode resonated with you, send it to someone you love. Maybe it'll spark a different kind of conversation. And thank you so much for being here and for thinking deeply with me and for always choosing growth. If you made it this far, I appreciate you so, so much. And I can't wait to chat with you again in next week's episode. Lots of love, Parmis.